What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Fable 1. As I am taking a look back at the trilogy of Fable games ahead of the reboot, I want to basically give myself a reference for these games that I haven't played in like a decade, so I can give people a proper perspective about the reboot, what it changed, what it kept, etc. when it comes. Now, normally this is where I would give people my spiel about how I 100% games, but I'll skip that today purely because this is an old title. And honestly, if I wasn't playing the anniversary edition that came with achievements and everything as you would expect from a modern game, I'd probably just label it a retrospective and call it good. And also it feels nice to mix things up every once in a while. Now with that in mind, if you want to play Fable 1 these days, you essentially have two options. At least on PC, obviously you can play it on console as well, I believe, but PC, on Steam in particular, you can choose between the original Lost Chapters release, which is the game plus its sort of expansion, the Lost Chapters, and the Anniversary Edition. Now the original game released in 2004, with the Anniversary Edition releasing back in 2014, and it made a fair few changes, mostly to things like lighting and graphics, of course, that you would expect from a remaster, but it also changed other things, like the save system, for instance. And that's why, personally, I think the Anniversary Edition is the way to play it, but as with anything, people have their preferences, and you will sometimes hear people prefer the original release as well, down to things like how the game itself looked, etc. Speaking for myself, while I have played both, I'm Anniversary Edition all the way just because it's frankly a little bit easier. Now you compare that to something like Fable 2, which never released on PC, and then Fable 3, which got a Steam release briefly before the Games for Windows Live Marketplace shut down. And while I own that game on PC and actually got it ready when I decided to play all of these, it's a bit of a pain to get running. So both of those are less available, let's say, than the original title, which I always thought was a sort of interesting way for things like that to pan out because it's probably not what you would expect. But let's talk about what this game actually is. Now, Fable 1 is, I would say, a very ambitious game for something that came out all the way back in 2004, at least originally. It has several systems that attempt to make you feel like you're actually interacting with a world. There's an economy system, there's a morality system, your character's appearance changes based on all sorts of factors, time is passing, your character can age, etc., etc. Now, as probably is not surprising for a game that released in 2004, its success at the things it was trying to do are a little bit varied. In many ways, I think a lot of these systems are easily broken, while still at the same time being extremely charming for what they are. Now, some of that, I admit, is nostalgia on my own part. I originally played this game via its original release all the way back in what was middle school for me at the time. And then again, as an adult, with the Anniversary Edition, which I 100% a little after it released in the early part of 2015. And having played through it again, obviously, for this review, I can say it is mostly the game that I remembered. Broken, silly, and a ton of fun at the same time. So with that said, let's actually dive into the rest of this review, starting with the technical state. Now, I've already discussed a fair bit of this, but what I want to discuss here is some of the differences you might notice in the Lost Chapters release on Steam and the Anniversary Edition. Now, the Anniversary Edition, in terms of it running, is perfectly fine. No crashes, no trouble, anything like that. As a content creator, I had a little trouble recording the thing. A lot of the footage kept coming out garbled until I messed with some settings, basically. But once I got that sorted out, I really didn't have any other issues. But that's not to say there aren't any bugs. If anything, there's actually some bugs that are still around from the original release. Probably the most common one that you'll see people mention is that when your character pulls back on a bow, it's supposed to increase the damage sort of as you pull back, of course. And while you might think there's a limit on that, there actually isn't. So the longer you hold down the button, the longer yet the damage will scale up, and that goes pretty much for as long as you feel like holding that button down. And there's also bugs with the inventory that were never fixed, meaning that if you do things super fast, sometimes you can duplicate them. But at this point, a lot of those work in your favor more so than they do against you. Probably the biggest thing of note that was never fixed that is genuinely annoying, though, is the camera itself. Now, this was a thing in the original game and here, but basically the camera is like bouncy, for lack of a better word. It often like sort of jitters as it moves around to follow you. And not even just outside in combat and everything, but rather when you're in conversations and cutscenes and the like, sometimes it will sort of misposition itself on your character, and I think this is down to the fact that your character can be different heights based on your skill in a certain stat you can increase. Basically, the skill tree, as you increase that, it will make your character taller. And it seems like in some cutscenes, the camera just doesn't quite know where it should be in order to capture your face. But that's about as serious as it gets for the Anniversary Edition. Now, for the original release, you actually have a few more problems, specifically things like support for various modes that are more common these days, like ultra-wide monitors, Linux-based systems, that kind of thing. And it's probably also worth a mention that the Anniversary Edition overhauled the save system, allowing you to pretty much save anywhere, anytime, and be able to pick back up from there, whereas in the original it used a sort of checkpoint system where if you saved in the middle of a quest, it would actually typically just roll you back to the start of that quest, causing you to potentially lose some progress, though thankfully the game is not long enough for that to be a huge detriment, as you can beat this entire game in like a day if you really wanted to. But even then, the original version should still run without too many problems on most modern hardware, but the Anniversary Edition makes that much, much easier and is the edition I personally would recommend to most people. At least if you can get it for a sale or something, because for whatever reason, the Anniversary Edition is still like $35 full price over on Steam, which is surprisingly high for a game that old, even if it is a remaster, but that's a whole separate thing. Now from there, let's talk difficulty. Broadly speaking, Fable and its sequels really are all very easy games. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to actually die playing this game normally, but it's worth a mention that the remaster did actually offer a secondary difficulty, a hard mode that disabled things like resurrection vials and caused enemies to hit harder, if you're looking for something that might actually approach a challenge. Now, to explain that a little bit, the base game, or the normal version, has resurrection vials. These go into effect if your character loses all your health. Basically, they restore you to life, but you could have tons of these, and if you're fully geared up, chances are enemies are going to do extremely minimal damage to you anyway, meaning that it is extremely difficult for you to actually die. Unless, of course, you decide to turn on this hard mode that is now available. But even then, if you exploit some, I would say, common methods of destroying things, you'll probably still be okay, because it's just not a very difficult game. Moving on a little bit, though, this game does not feature a character creation. Rather, we are set as a young boy from Oakvale. Oakvale being a quiet, cozy town right up until the day that it's raided by bandits, but Oakvale itself serves as your introduction to the game. It sets up a lot of the game's mechanics, such as good or evil deeds, basically, and how that affects your morality, and how the world can even react to it as well, which makes up a lot of your choices that you're going to have along the way. But the crux of this is that you are attempting to buy a present for your sister's birthday, and then when you go to give it to her, your village is attacked by bandits while you are out in the fields, and it is presumed that your entire family died, basically, as you go to your family home only to find your father dead, and a bandit comes rushing at you before you are saved by Maze. Maze is a member of the Heroes Guild, and given that you are now an orphan, he takes you there because he doesn't know what else to do with you, where you are raised as a hero. And that's sort of the basic setup of the game. We become a hero and then go around doing hero things as people make requests of the guild. But from there, there's a handful of other things I want to talk about in relation to the story in particular, and its choice and consequence, let's say. Overall, just broad strokes right out of the gate if you don't want the spoilers before you skip ahead. I think the opening is surprisingly strong. I mean, I don't think it's original by today's standards or anything, but I think it does that kind of thing really well and pulls you into the narrative very quickly. Now, unfortunately, the rest of the story kind of fails to live up to that. Not to say that it's god-awful or anything, but it's very quick, and there's a fair bit of narrative dissonance as you go. For instance, over the course of the next 10 hours, our character's gonna age probably 30 to 40 years and is not going to see that reflected in the face of anyone else. And that's down to things like how the game handles its system with your character changing via the world, but you age super fast for some reason, whereas everyone else is apparently sipping from the fountain of youth. It also doesn't help that you go from slaying a local wasp problem to taking out the Bandit King in like a day, only to then turn around and be crowned the arena champion before being sent to prison the very next day. So basically, it's just a story that's moving super fast, which can make it feel a little sillier than it's trying to be be at times, and I think if they had sort of paced that narrative out a little slower, it would have made more sense, but given the relatively small scale of the game, it's not a huge surprise. Now, to some people, that might not necessarily be a bad thing. Truth be told, this game, main story-wise, which will see you interacting with at least most of the content, is probably only going to run you like 10 hours. I 100% this originally in about 20 back in 2015, and doing everything again for the sake of making this video only took me about 25 hours, and like 3 of that was just trying to get my recording software to work. But for me at least, that very rushed pace, it feels like, undercuts a lot of the bigger story moments. For instance, you grow up with this girl named Whisper, who is also in the Heroes Guild at the time, and she goes on to be your rival of sorts in a few quests, only for you to then have the choice of killing or sparing her in the arena once you get to that point in the game. But, I mean, you've seen this girl like maybe a handful of times up to this point, so it's a pretty meaningless person to you. You basically just choose the good or evil choice, and there's little in the way of consequences regardless, but even that is one of the more impactful decisions you can make, because killing her grants you a whole host of rewards in the form of cold hard cash, but if you choose to kill her, you'll also get an earful every time you meet the character Thunder. The thing is, Thunder's role in the story is set regardless of what happens to Whisper. It just changes how he talks to you. And I think a moment like that is really great at exemplifying what this game succeeds and fails at the same time. Because this game succeeds in letting you create your own character who can make all these decisions, and those decisions are reflected both on your face via the morality options and in the way people react to your character. But in terms of like narrative consequences or locking yourself off of content, it just doesn't really happen outside of a few binary quest decisions where you pick one side of a quest or the other. Now, right around the arena, though, is where things tend to pick up a lot, because at this point you'll have killed the Bandit King, found your sister, Teresa, who was actually not killed in the raid, but only had her eyes gouged out before it turns out that through the power of will, as they call it, or magic, she can basically still see and has premonitions. This was useful to the Bandit King who kept her alive, and it's through Teresa here that you're going to actually find your mother, who was apparently only abducted and imprisoned in the raid on your village. This was done specifically by a character named Jack of Blades because of your family's bloodline. You descend from someone important, and your blood is the key to unlocking what is called the Sword of Aeons, a sword that the game describes as blood forged from your own bloodline in ages past, and with the death of each of your family members and the blood that comes into contact with this sword, it only grows stronger, and Jack wants to use this sword to take over the world, essentially, and that's why he's done everything that he's done. But once you finally manage to free your mother from prison, which comes with a mandatory minimum 1-year prison sentence of your own, you'll of course finally be able to attempt to track down the keys to this sword and try to get to it before Jack does, which leads to, I think, one of the better story moments this game has. You see Maze at the very beginning of the game, who acts as your sort of mentor, it turns out has actually been working for the Jack of Blades the entire time, and you have to fight him off as he trapped your sister as you guys went to get the key to the sword. And this becomes a sort of full circle moment for your character where he saved you as a child, but now you have to kill him to save your family because he's actively in your way, essentially. And yet somehow, even as he lay there dying, he still seems almost proud of you. It's a really weird moment. Now from there, you go on to, of course, chase the Jack of Blades in the game's end game, where you're fighting off all sorts of enemies, chasing the guy through various places you've already been, before confronting him at the heart of the guild as he tries to take the Sword of Aeons. He kills your mother as he attempts to do this, and once you kill him, you're left with the sword and a choice. Basically, this sword is incredibly powerful, though hilariously I wouldn't even consider it the best sword in the game, but it does have some great augmentations, which we'll get to. But you can either kill your sister, granting her blood to the sword and giving you the most powerful version of it that you can have while you are still alive, or you can cast the sword into the abyss left by Jack's death, sealing away its power forever, or so you would think. And this choice right here and your current morality leads to one of the game's 4 brief endings, basically describing what happens to you in the world after. But basically, your current alignment and what choice you make here are all that are factored in. And that's typically where the game would end, but the lost chapters, or at least the biggest part of it, kicks in right here. Now, it's probably important to mention that the lost chapters touches basically every bit of the game in some way. It adds a lot of quests and areas and rewards, to the base game as you play through it, and then once you've beaten the main game, it opens up a sort of final act that I would say brings about a better close overall. This is going to see you headed to the frozen north, sailing upon a ghost ship only to run into more enemy encounters, new weapons, armor, a new settlement to terrorize, some lore dumps even if you really care about the world. And then, this part is kind of a spoiler for the actual last boss if you haven't clicked off the story section by now. It turns out that Jack is not actually dead because whatever he is not mortal, to be sure. Basically, that rift that opened up when he died that he took the sword potentially through has somehow regurgitated him back into life, and he's taken over the form of something beyond a great door that he was sealed behind by who I believe is supposed to be your character's ancient ancestor, and you have to fight him one final time, and then once he's dead, you take the mask from when you defeated him originally and either choose to wear it or throw it into the lava to destroy it forever. And regardless of what you choose, so ends our first Fable. But of course, the game doesn't end there. After that, the world is your oyster. You can keep exploring and taking advantage of the game's many systems and gameplay and world, as there's a not insignificant amount of things you can get up to that aren't the story in this game, which is where I think it probably shines the most. Starting with the progression systems, though. So progression in this game basically comes down to your stats, gear, and then your actual character, via things like appearance and how they change over the course of a game according to your actions. But starting with the simple parts, stats. As we kill things, complete quests, we're going to be gaining experience, and we can spend this experience at the Heroes Guild to increase some of our hero disciplines. Might, skill, and magic. Now, might and skill tend to just give you flat increases to things such as your damage with various weapons, and thus your strength, your health, and your damage reduction via your toughness. These are going to make your character physically bigger. Then you have your skill. These are things like your speed, accuracy, and guile. Speed is, of course, how fast you can do things. Accuracy is how much the bow shakes, basically, when you're doing all that. And then guile is your ability to both sneak as well as trade with shops, and the higher levels actually unlock other things like the ability to steal and pick locks in town, at least. Probably worth a mention that while it is possible to sneak, it's only really useful in a non-combat context, as things like stealth attacks, etc. just aren't a thing here. But in town, if you want to go, say, burglarize all the shops, you can definitely do that with guile. But then we have magic. Magic's a little more complicated because there's your base magic power, which raises your mana, and then there's all of the various spells you can learn and the levels associated with them. But all of those stats, as you increase them, of course, give you access to various modes of gameplay, but what's more, they physically alter your character in some way. So the might stuff makes you bigger, skill makes you taller, and magic will eventually give your character these sort of arcane tattoos and a magical glow to things like your hands, which is one of the many ways this game will physically represent the actions you are taking as things you can see on your character. Now, the other part of this is your morality. As you move through the game, if you're a bad person or a good person, you'll get horns or a halo as a direct representation of this. Also, your hair changes color, which honestly I think is a pretty cool thing to do. But outside of that, progression also comes down to gear. Now, these are things like the armor you're wearing, and of course the weapons you're using. Now, when it comes to armor, there's a few things you have to know. Basically, there are stats associated with them beyond just their simple armor value. For instance, the type of armor you're wearing can affect your alignment choices and how scary or attractive you are to various villagers, which then, of course, appropriately reflects the response they're going to give when you walk by. But there's also about 4 tiers to all of these weapons and armors. Armor's a little less so because there's just a lot of them and you can kind of pick whatever looks best for you if you want. But the plate mail, and especially the special variant of it called the Archon's armor in the Lost chapters, is what is going to give you the most damage reduction. Weapons, though, can be divided up into iron, steel, obsidian, and then a masterwork. And then bows have a couple other things like oak and yew, but that's essentially the gist of it, and each of those is better than the last and corresponds to a different tier of damage, etc. But then we have the augmentations. A lot of your better weapons, or the higher tiers of them, will come with free slots to augment them with. You'll basically be able to find these little gemstones as you go and slot them into the weapons, which can alter what they do. That's a cool system in theory, but it ultimately proves useless because the best weapons are actually special weapons that you can buy or find, mostly find, throughout the game. And these sort of legendary items already come with pre-installed augmentations that make that system basically useless. Though I would say the one exception to this is a special kind of joke weapon you can find, which is the frying pan, which comes at the end of a long treasure hunt. But by the time you get that item, even if you augment it with its more than usual amount of augment slots, it still winds up being much worse damage-wise than anything you would be able to use by that point in terms of legendary weapons. In fact, my favorite weapon winds up out DPSing, so to speak, every other weapon you find, and it comes from a shop. But then you have stuff that's a little harder to get, like Skorm's bow, which you can only get by getting an appropriate amount of Evil Boy points by sacrificing people at the Chapel of Skorm, and you have to maximize your points and thus your chance at getting the bow by sacrificing someone as close to midnight as possible, while preferably you yourself are good, to maximize the amount of evil you're getting. And once you get above a certain threshold, I'm pretty sure it's guaranteed. Otherwise, it's just a chance-based system past a certain point. Basically, Skorm's bow is a little complicated to get, but if you're willing to go through the trouble, it's the best bow in the game, and it's not even close. And none of those weapons are going to need you to put augments in them, which means that system is kind of a waste of time outside of like the first hour or two of the game. So progression, like a lot of things, and I'm going to expand on this here in a minute with combat actually, is kind of broken. And in spite of that, still manages to be fun. Which brings us to the gameplay and world section. Now on a functional level, this game is basically small interconnected maps that you can run through to get to the next area, and altogether they form your sort of world map. These maps can basically be divided into settlements and non-settlements. Your sort of wilderness zones are pretty much what you'd expect. You'd go there, there's enemies to fight, exploration to be had, secrets to find. But then we have the actual settlement locations. These are a little bit different, and I would say where a lot of the more fun things come up, because this is where most of your NPCs are. You can find traveling salesmen and things like that out in the wilderness that, you can of course help or waylay. But in town's a different story. Now, Bowerstone is like the main city, and they'll take your weapons there, so it's a little more difficult to do. But in other settlements, you can go around and massacre the entire village very easily if you want to, which we'll get to in just a moment. But once you're in these settlements, how you interact with these people is largely up to you. You can break their doors down and run in, steal everything from their house, kill them, take their stuff, and leave if you want. And if you can deal with the guards on the way out, there's very little they can do to stop you. But beyond just more obvious brute force things like that, you can also interact with the NPCs via things like expressions, or, emotes these days, but the game calls them expressions. You can perform these in and around villagers, and based on your other stats, like the attractiveness or scariness of all the things you've accumulated on your character, which can be affected by things like a barber shop or a tattoo shop, and the ways you've customized your character once you've gotten into town, changes how they react to you. They can be scared of you, simply in awe if your renown is high enough, or they may even fall in love with you, which gives you the potential to do things like go get married, though anybody who's not marrying Lady Grey is missing out. But you can even use this system to make them do things like, say, follow you to a secluded place in the woods, where it's much easier to get them out of the way. And while that might seem dark and sinister, it's okay, I actually just need to do this so I can get a chance at buying up their property, which becomes available if the owner dies. Every town has one house available by default, and that'll be the marital home of the town, which is the one you could move a spouse into if you wanted to, but you can also rent these out. And if you go around killing the owners of other houses, you can buy up those buildings too. And then you can start upgrading and renting them out, including things like the shops. And this lets you turn the entire game into a sort of marketing simulator. If you don't have time for all that and you simply want to steal from shops, you can upgrade your guile, which is going to allow you to pick the lock on shops, run in, steal things, and hopefully avoid the law while you're at it, which is where the stealth system comes in, which is basically just a crouch toggle. Now, if a guard sees you do this, you'll of course be given a fine, but you can just leave for a while and that'll eventually fall off. And in doing this and becoming the sort of ultra landlord feared through all corners of Albion, you'll become very rich. But truth be told, that's not even necessary. There are other ways to break the economy. You can buy and trade goods also based on how good your guile is, as items have a base value and you can either buy or sell above that, and you can take that stuff to different shops that have their own wants and things they'll pay more for. They get deliveries every few days that adjust what they have available. And it's things like that that make the world of Fable feel surprisingly alive. Like, you can interact with what this world is so much more than you might initially think, or that the game even implies is a possibility. Which leads to some of my favorite content this game has to offer. Things like the silver keys and chests, demon doors, boasting, mini games, and then of course, fantastic side quests. So let's start with the silver keys and chest because that's easy. So all throughout the game you'll find silver keys. There are 30 of these, and you use them to open silver chests based on how many of them you found. They don't go away when you open chests with them, so this is cumulative. And then you open these chests for various rewards, of course. Now, for the most part, these can be pretty decent, but realistically, I think by the time you get the keys to open some of the better ones, what you get from them is largely outdated. With the exception of the 25 key chest and the Lost Chapters, which contains the Archon's armor, which at least in terms of, armor rating is the best you can get. But once you've found all the keys and opened all the chests, you're just then left with a bunch of keys, you would think. Well, the Lost Chapters also addressed this via one of their demon doors. Now, demon doors are sort of like little mini puzzles. They are living doors that are going to ask something of you, and if you perform whatever it is they need you to do, they will then open up and give you a reward, which is honestly just a really fun little system because the doors themselves both have personalities, but also because you have to figure the thing out. And at least back when this game was made, it was just a very little charming interaction. But the Lost Chapters adds one of these doors that actually wants a silver key, and you'll give them all of the silver keys you have in your inventory, which means after you've gone through the game and, used all of them everywhere that it is applicable, you can then give all those keys to open up this demon door, which gives you access to a really cool sword. But these demon doors often have really great rewards via things like max health or mana elixirs, which you can honestly find a lot of places, but also special weapons and full outfits that might be annoying to get otherwise, but honestly, just solving the puzzle is usually a lot of the fun of it. But one in particular can only be opened by marrying Lady Grey, which is another fantastic piece of side content. So right after you finish the arena and the main story, you'll get an audience with the mayor of Bowerstone, Lady Grey. She effectively is asking you to jump through a bunch of hoops to marry her, if you do everything she wants you to do. But in doing this, you're almost certainly going to find out that Lady Grey is a murderer because she killed her sister to make sure that she could become the mayor. Because despite being called a mayor, it's somewhat hereditary, it would seem. But where a lot of choices in this game tend to be very binary in the sense that you either do this or that, stuff with Lady Grey can have a whole host of outcomes because she's asking you to do a lot of things, such as finding her lost necklace, and you can solve that a variety of ways. If you need to solve it at all, because if you investigate and find out that she's a murderer, you can actually skip that step, and then you can choose to either turn her in and expose what she's got going on, or choose to ignore it and marry her anyway, which then gives you access to a very specific demon door that only opens if you marry Lady Grey. Once upon a time, you also couldn't get the silver key that was in her bedroom, but the Lost Chapters version of the game changed that, and now you only miss out on the demon door. But that side quest in particular has a lot of different outcomes, each with consequences and the like, and I thought that was really fun and cool to see. But realistically, most of the game's side content doesn't really compare to that because it is much simpler and usually just sees you on like one side or the other of a conflict. In some cases, you might be helping bandits raid something, and others you might be defending against those bandits, which is about as impactful as the consequences of your actions typically are. What the game does much better is reactivity to the choices you have made via things like how you are greeted by villagers and whether or not they just straight up run away from you, etc., etc. But the story and all that is unfortunately pretty immutable, though that was hardly uncommon at the time this game was made. But then I saved the best for last. One of my favorite things you can do in this game is boasting, actually. When you take a card from the guild, some of them allow you to boast, or basically say you'll complete the quest in a certain way. Often this involves doing it unarmored, using only your fists, or a handful of other objectives that change based on exactly what you are doing. So, say protecting someone, that person won't take any damage at all, that kind of thing. And you can earn extra gold and stuff from boasting about the way you were going to handle these quests and then following through on it, which I think is just such a fun idea for a game like this, and can lead to some truly funny moments in cutscenes where it's this serious thing playing out, but your character's in their underwear. But all of that doesn't even touch on things like the fishing minigame and how that can lead you to certain items, silver keys, secrets, etc., etc. But basically, the way the gameplay and world of this game is structured is where it shines, even if some of it is honestly just straight up broken. But that brings us to combat, which I would say is also broken in the sense that it's not very good. So combat is definitely this game's, I would say, weak spot. It's got its fun moments, don't get me wrong. If anything, as I recall, this game has the best magic system of the trilogy, where basically you buy the abilities, slot them into a hotbar or a hotkey, and there you go. You can just spam it away as long as you have mana, which is fun because it allows you to alter the effects of other forms of combat, such as the multi-attack, which makes your sword do multiple swings on a single attack, or allows you to shoot like 5 or 6 arrows all at once, which is devastating to bosses and just enemies in general. But also more fun stuff like force push, pushing everyone away from you, friend and foe alike, your giant AoE attacks, your lightning blasts, some of which are based on alignment, but if you're a physical character in particular, that is to say a warrior, you're almost certainly going to need physical shield, which is going to protect you from attacks and not stagger you at the cost of your mana. But that becomes necessary because combat in the end of the game is a bit of a mess. You're basically surrounded by tons of enemies all the time, and it's very easy to get sort of stun-locked if you're not abusing some sort of mechanic to handle the swarms of enemies coming at you. Which brings one of my main problems with melee combat, which is blocking. So, as you might imagine, there is a block function, but the issue with blocking is that the time it takes your character to block is longer than the swing animation of most enemies, which means it's effectively impossible to actually block an incoming attack unless you were already blocking before they even move to initiate said attack. Which means when it comes to blocking, you're just doing guesswork, and it's easier to do other forms of combat, such as using physical shield like I mentioned, or just going with bows. Multi-arrow on Skorm's bow, which you can get right away at the start of the game if you know how, is absolutely devastating and infinitely easier than basically anything else you could do. So archery remains incredible, even if it's not a stealth archer in this case. But then we have magic. Magic is the most fun because it is at the same time its own playstyle, but also an augment to other playstyles. You can go all in on magic and have it form your primary mode of attack, or you can pick up magic that specifically augments your other abilities, like multi-attack and multi-arrow, force push for the sake of keeping things away from you, which is also great if you're an archer, one that causes enemies to be charmed and fight for you instead, and a whole host of others. And it's a lot of fun because of how simple yet extremely powerful it is. Now, honestly, it's probably a little too powerful, which is probably why they tried to change it in the subsequent titles, but really kind of failed to live up to the initial fantasy of what it was all about, because magic in this first game is just so fun to mess around with. And as a result, magic is the real hero, because it takes this combat system that is otherwise just a mess and manages to make it fun in spite of the fact that it's still bad. But from here I wanted to talk about the thing that determines how much experience you actually get from combat, which I saved for now, simply because it's another way in which you can easily break this game, which is the combat multiplier. Now, at a glance, the better you do in combat, the more you hit enemies, the higher your combat multiplier will go, which means you get more experience in combat to thus upgrade your abilities and everything. Now, the issue with this is that there's a few places in the game where you can effectively spawn infinite easily killable enemies and push your combat multiplier up into outrageous places and then get impossible amounts of experience extremely quickly. And next thing you know, you've got basically everything maxed out in the span of like an hour or two, effectively destroying anything this game had in terms of its progression. Now, the experience you get when enemies die is divided up into a few different types. Now, technically, the enemies drop normal experience or general experience that you can use on anything, but the method in which you use to attack enemies also grants you experience in smaller amounts, divided up into might, magic, and skill, giving you specific experience for both how you're actively engaging with combat, but also granting you general experience to make sure you can level up other things as well. And as a concept, I love that. In execution with this combat multiplier, it's rarely a system that you don't abuse, because even just playing the game normally, this becomes very easy to manipulate, and just about the only way to not become an overpowered monstrosity who's good at absolutely everything is by deliberately ignoring this. But in short, combat is fun mostly because of magic, but oftentimes the camera's terrible, your control when you try to do things like dodge roll is terrible, melee's pretty awful because of things like the block timings, archery is incredibly overpowered and the easiest way to play, whereas magic is incredibly fun and augments the other two play styles, such as making melee combat not feel terrible, or turning archery into a superpower, or simply being fun all on its own. So like many things about Fable, it's fun, but incredibly broken. But all of that finally brings us to the Steam Deck section before we start wrapping this thing up. So, Steam Deck for this game is a bit of a weird one because you're looking at two different versions of the game, essentially. The Lost Chapters or the Anniversary Edition. The Lost Chapters version has a playable rating, and the Anniversary Edition has a verified rating. Now, with the original version, it looks like they didn't really have support for Linux-based systems there, and just the age of that one as well can cause you all sorts of problems. Now, with the Anniversary Edition in particular, I have seen people on the Steam forums talk about problems that the game has had in terms of getting it to launch and things like that, but most of it seems to have been around when the Steam Deck first came out, and these days, I can say that, at least for me, the game ran incredibly well on the Steam Deck for the Anniversary Edition specifically. In fact, I think this might actually be a little better for a lot of people to play on Steam Deck in particular, because the camera seemed a little less finicky on the Steam Deck for whatever reason, which may be down to the controller support specifically, but regardless, you should be able to play the Anniversary Edition on Steam Deck without too much of a hassle, if any at all. Which brings us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So, on the positive side of things, I think the way this game allows you to define who your character is in terms of how they look, and moreover what your actions do to the way your character looks and how then villagers and the like react to them, is really fantastic in a way that I think even games today could certainly learn something from, which I would say is probably most relevant to the reboot coming up specifically. On top of that, the other big positive for me is just interacting with the world, because yes, a lot of these systems are broken. Buying up literally every house in every village to break the economy, which isn't even necessary at all, and is easily done and doesn't even slap you with much of a fine, because even if you go through town and rampage all of these characters, you can just leave for a little while and come back later and that's completely gone. And each little settlement tracks its own crime, even Bowerstone, which is technically split into two separate maps, and each map of Bowerstone tracks crime separately. But all of that stuff, no matter how broken it is, always manages to be fun, and that's what makes it so compelling to play Fable 1 even these days. And luckily, its added sense of humor and atmosphere kind of goes hand in hand with that. But on the negative side, we have the more obvious stuff. The fact that so much of this stuff just is broken. The game is laughably easy. Combat is terrible if you take magic out of the equation, which the sequels did in the sense that they made magic much worse to use, but we'll get to those. Then there's the bad camera and the fact that underneath the surface of everything, in terms of like villagers and stuff reacting to you, there's basically no consequence to any of your decisions. Nothing really changes outside of some dialogue here and there in most instances, which makes all of the story decisions you do make fall a little flat, frankly. But when it comes to a conclusion, I would say that most of this game's negatives could be chalked up to simply when the game was made. It originally released all the way back in 2004, for instance. I would say, if anything, this game was simply more ambitious than they really had the tools to work with at that time. And it's perhaps because of that I tend to lump this game in with things like Morrowind or Oblivion, simply on a much smaller scale. Because while those games are bigger, Fable does a lot of the same stuff, at least at its heart. And much like those games, I love it in spite of its flaws, and perhaps a little bit because of some of them. It's real easy to pick apart Fable 1 as an experience because so many of these systems individually can fall apart pretty easily, but once you put it all together and you enter this sort of little simulation, it becomes much greater than the sum of its parts. Which is why I think, in spite of the fact that Fable 1 is such a mess in so many ways, still manages to be fun. And that's the most incredible part about this game to me, because for every problem it has, I was having fun the entire time. And yeah, sure, if it had gone on for another 10 hours, probably wouldn't have. But luckily, it doesn't. So whether you're playing the original version of the Lost Chapters or the Anniversary Edition, I think Fable is a fun look at the past. I wouldn't say it holds up today, but it's a fun, weird, charming little game, which makes for a great look back at a broader history of games if you feel so inclined. Now, my only gripe about recommending this game specifically is that if you want to grab the Anniversary Edition, the fact that they're still charging $35 for that is crazy to me. I could see like 10 or 15, but 35 is a lot for a game this old and a remaster that barely even fixed some of the prominent bugs of the original. Especially when one of the DLCs for the Anniversary Edition effectively just adds the weapons and armors of NPCs you can run into along the way for like $15. That's wild. Now comparatively, the Lost Chapters is just $10. So there is certainly that. But that gripe aside, if you can find the Anniversary Edition on a sale or something, that's certainly a great way to go, but that's just my opinion. Either way, this was a fun trip down memory lane for me, and I'm looking forward to diving into the other two games ahead of that reboot, which is where we are going to wrap up this particular video. So if you want to chime in about anything we went over here, the next two games, or of course the upcoming reboot and what you'd like to see, definitely drop that down in the comment section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.